Imagine it's March 15th, 2003. You're a 44-year-old civil engineer living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your apartment is modest but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a small balcony overlooking a tree-lined street in the Palermo neighborhood. You have spent 20 years saving. You have a pension. You have a bank account. You have a life that makes sense. Every Sunday, you take your daughter to the same cafe on Avenida Santa Fe, order the same medialunas, drink the same cortado, and feel the quiet satisfaction of a man who played by the rules. You did everything right. You saved in dollars because everyone told you dollars were safe. You kept your money in the bank because that is what responsible people do. You trusted the system because the system had always been there. And then, almost overnight, it was not. If you have ever wondered why the United States dollar is treated like the most important currency on earth, even when America itself is drowning in debt, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened to dozens of countries across 100 years of modern history. And every single time, the countries that lost their special monetary status paid a price that took generations to recover from. The dollar's reserve status is not just a financial privilege. It is the single thread holding an increasingly fragile system together. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Back to Buenos Aires. Back to our engineer. Because what happened to him, and to millions like him, is the clearest possible illustration of what it means when a country loses its monetary anchor. Argentina in 2001 and 2002 did not simply have a financial crisis. It had a complete collapse of monetary trust. The peso had been pegged to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 ratio since 1991. 1 peso, $1. Simple, clean, reassuring. The government called it convertibility. Ordinary Argentines called it stability. For a decade it worked. Inflation dropped. Businesses planned, families saved, then the cracks appeared. The government borrowed heavily. The dollar strengthened globally, dragging the peso with it and making Argentine exports too expensive. The trade balance deteriorated, foreign debt mounted. And in December 2001, the government froze bank accounts in what became known as the corralito, meaning the little corral, the little pen, trapping savings inside a system that was already burning. By January 2002, Argentina had defaulted on $93 billion in sovereign debt, the largest default in history at that time. The peso was devalued. Within weeks, 1 peso was worth 25 cents, not $1. Our engineer's savings, the ones he kept in pesos, lost 3/4 of their value in a matter of weeks. His dollar savings were converted to pesos by government decree and then immediately devalued. He lost everything he had built in 2 decades, not because he made bad choices, but because he trusted a currency that had no independent foundation, no reserve status, no global anchor. This is what this video is about. The United States dollar is not strong because America is strong. It is strong because the world decided, 70 years ago, to make it the center of everything. And that decision, made in a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944, has protected America from the exact fate that destroyed our engineers' savings. The reserve status of the dollar is a privilege so enormous that most Americans have never had to think about it. But history shows, with brutal clarity, what happens when that privilege ends, and understanding why it exists, why it persists, and what threatens it, may be the most important financial education you can give yourself. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about what reserve currency status actually means and why it functions the way it does. Think of the global financial system as a highway. Every country drives on this highway. They trade goods, they buy oil, they settle debts, they make investments. Now imagine that every toll booth on that highway only accepts one currency. Only one. And the country that prints that currency gets to drive for free. More than that, they get to collect a quiet, invisible tax from every other driver every single time they pass through. This is what economists call seigniorage, the profit a government makes simply from the fact that its currency is used by others. But for the United States, it goes far beyond that. Because the dollar is the global reserve currency, the currency that central banks around the world hold as their primary store of value, America can run deficits that would destroy any other country. It can borrow at lower interest rates than anyone else. It can print money with consequences that are partially absorbed by the rest of the world rather than falling entirely on Americans. The economist Barry Eichengreen called this the exorbitant privilege. That phrase was actually coined in the 1960s by French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was furious about it. He watched France work hard to earn dollars through trade while America simply printed them. He was right to be frustrated. But frustration does not change the mechanism, and the mechanism is this. When the world needs dollars to settle trade, buy oil, or hold reserves, demand for dollars stays permanently elevated. That demand props up the dollar's value. That elevated value allows America to import goods cheaply, borrow cheaply, and maintain a standard of living that its underlying productivity alone would not fully justify. The reserve status is the foundation. Remove it, and the whole structure settles. Fast. This brings us directly to the first major lesson history has to teach on this subject, and it comes from a place most people do not immediately think of when they think about reserve currencies. It comes from Britain. For nearly a century, from roughly the 1820s to the 1930s, the British pound was the world's reserve currency. London was the center of global finance. The Bank of England set the tempo for the world economy. British government bonds, called gilts, were the safest asset on earth. Sterling flowed through every port, every trading house, every colonial economy. The British Empire's reach meant the pound was everywhere. And just like the dollar today, this status allowed Britain to run deficits, to borrow at favorable rates, to project a power beyond what its domestic economy alone could sustain. Then came the First World War. Britain borrowed massively to fund the war, primarily from the United States. Between 1914 and 1918, Britain went from being the world's largest creditor nation to owing the United States approximately $4 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum for that era. The war shattered the economic foundations that had supported sterling's dominance. Britain tried to restore the gold standard at the pre-war parity in 1925, a decision pushed by Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill and widely criticized by the economist John Maynard Keynes, who warned it would crush British industry. Keynes was right. The overvalued pound strangled exports. Unemployment rose. The Great Depression hit. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931. And the pound, though it remained important for decades in what became known as the Sterling area, former colonies and Commonwealth nations, never recovered its singular global dominance. By 1944, when representatives of 44 allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war financial order, it was the American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, that shaped the outcome, not the British delegation, despite the brilliance of John Maynard Keynes, who led it. The dollar replaced the pound. And Britain spent the next 4 decades managing a slow, painful decline in its currency's global standing. In 1976, Britain was forced to go to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for a bailout of $3.9 billion. The country that had once been the world's banker was now borrowing from it. The transition from reserve currency dominance to ordinary currency status took about 50 years, but the pain was real, persistent, and structural. It did not arrive all at once. It seeped in like water through an old foundation. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. Britain lost its reserve currency status gradually, over decades, and yet ordinary British people still felt it, in rising prices, in declining purchasing power, in a sense that the country was somehow less than it used to be. My question for you is this: if that slow erosion happened to the most powerful empire on earth, with a currency that had been dominant for over a century, what would a similar transition look like in a world that moves at the speed of digital finance? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. The second historical lesson comes not from a great power losing its crown, but from what happens to ordinary countries when they try to borrow the credibility of a reserve currency instead of earning their own. And no case study illustrates this more painfully than Lebanon between 2016 and 2023. Lebanon is a small country. Its economy is roughly the size of a medium American city. For decades, Lebanon ran what was called a financial miracle. The Lebanese pound was pegged to the US dollar at 1,507.5 pounds per dollar, a peg that had held since 1997. Lebanese banks offered some of the highest interest rates in the world, sometimes 15% or more annually, on dollar deposits. Wealthy Lebanese diaspora, the millions of Lebanese living abroad in the Gulf, in Europe, in the Americas, poured money back into Lebanese banks. The banks in turn lent much of that money to the Lebanese government. The government used it to pay its bills, and to attract more deposits to pay old bills. You can already see the shape of this. It was a Ponzi scheme, a system where new money coming in was used to pay old obligations, with no underlying productive economy, generating real returns to justify the cycle. By 2019, Lebanon's public debt had reached 150% of its gross domestic product, meaning the country owed 1.5 times everything it produced in a year. The central bank, under Governor Riyad Salameh, was engaging in what later investigations called financial engineering, using complex transactions to make the balance sheet look healthier than it was. In October 2019, protests erupted. The government collapsed. Banks quietly began restricting withdrawals. Then the restrictions became official. By 2020, the Lebanese pound had begun a collapse that would, by 2023, see it lose more than 98% of its value against the dollar. A deposit of $100,000 in a Lebanese bank in 2019, real money, a family's life savings, was worth roughly $2,000 in purchasing power by 2023. Not because the banks were robbed. Because the system that had borrowed the dollar's credibility without having the dollar's foundations finally snapped under its own weight. The middle class was obliterated. Doctors, engineers, teachers, small business owners, people who had done everything right, watched their savings dissolve into nothing. The lesson Lebanon teaches is not just about mismanagement. It is about the difference between countries that have genuine monetary foundations and countries that merely rent them. Lebanon rented the dollar's credibility. When the rent came due, it had nothing to pay with. The foundation was always borrowed, and borrowed foundations do not hold. This leads to the third part of this story, and it brings us to the most extreme case in modern economic history, the one that every textbook mentions, but almost nobody fully explains in plain terms. Weimar Germany, 1921 to 1923. The story of hyperinflation in Germany is usually told as a curiosity. People carrying wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, children playing with stacks of million-mark notes. But behind the absurdity is a precise mechanism that is directly relevant to what we are discussing. After Germany lost the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles imposed reparations payments, debt obligations, that were denominated in gold or foreign currency, not in German marks. Germany's mark had no reserve status. No country needed marks to buy oil. No central bank held marks as a store of value. The mark was just Germany's domestic problem. When Germany could not earn enough foreign currency through exports to pay its reparations, it began printing marks, a lot of marks. The idea was to buy foreign currency with newly printed marks. But since nobody particularly wanted marks, the exchange rate collapsed. As the exchange rate collapsed, more marks were needed to buy the same amount of foreign currency. More marks were printed. The exchange rate collapsed further. This spiral, printing currency that nobody needs, causing its value to fall, requiring more printing, is called hyperinflation. And it is only possible when a currency has no external anchor, no reserve status, no structural global demand. In July 1922, $1 bought 493 German marks. By November 1923, $1 bought 4.2 trillion German marks. 4.2 trillion. A middle-class family in Frankfurt that had saved 10,000 marks in 1920, enough money to buy a comfortable house, could not buy a single loaf of bread with it by late 1923. The physical savings were still there. The numbers in the bank account had not changed. But the meaning of those numbers had been destroyed entirely. Now observe what all three of these cases have in common. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep reading the financial news without understanding the foundation beneath it. Most people will not see the through line connecting Buenos Aires 2002 to Beirut 2020 to Berlin 1923. If you are still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks, the part that connects these historical autopsies directly to the present. Argentina borrowed the dollar's credibility through a peg. Lebanon borrowed it through dollarization without real backing. Germany had no reserve status at all and printed to survive. All three collapsed when the gap between their actual monetary foundations and their borrowed or absent credibility became too wide to paper over. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. Now look at the United States. The difference, and it is a profound difference, is that America is not borrowing the dollar's credibility. America is the source of it. The dollar does not need to be backed by gold anymore. It stopped being backed by gold in 1971 when President Richard Nixon announced, on a Sunday evening television broadcast, that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This moment, known as the Nixon shock, ended the Bretton Woods system, but the dollar did not collapse. It did not hyperinflate. It did not lose its reserve status. Why? Because by 1971, the world had already organized itself so deeply around the dollar that shifting away was not just inconvenient. It was structurally impossible in the short term. The dollar had something more durable than a gold peg. It had network effects. Think of network effects like a telephone network. The first telephone was useless. The more people who had telephones, the more valuable every individual telephone became. The dollar, by 1971, was so embedded in global trade and oil contracts and debt instruments and central bank reserves that each additional user made it more valuable for every existing user to stay. This is the hidden architecture of dollar dominance. It is self-reinforcing. It is not just habit. It is structural. And here is the uncomfortable truth that the historical record forces us to confront. The reserve status is not infinite. It has never been infinite. Every reserve currency in history has eventually given way, not always dramatically. Sometimes slowly, like a river changing course. The old channel does not flood overnight. It just gradually carries less water. The dollar's exorbitant privilege is real, but it has limits. And those limits are being tested in ways that have historical precedent. 19. This brings us to the human dimension of this story, because the mechanism is important, but the cost is paid by real people. And history is very specific about who pays most. When monetary foundations crack, when reserve status is challenged, when inflation rises faster than wages, when currency values fall, the burden does not fall evenly. It never has. The people who pay most are always the same kind of people. They are the middle-class savers, the pensioners, the workers with fixed income assets, the small business owners holding cash. Consider what happened in Greece between 2010 and 2015 when the country's debt crisis erupted. Greece was part of the Eurozone, meaning it used the euro and could not print its own currency. In a sense, Greece had voluntarily adopted a foreign reserve currency, the euro, as its own. This gave it access to cheap borrowing for years, and then it could not pay. The Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund imposed austerity measures. These measures were in exchange for bailout loans. Between 2010 and 2015, Greek GDP fell by more than 25%, a depression deeper than the United States experienced during the 1930s. Unemployment reached 27% in 2013. Youth unemployment reached 60%. Pensions were cut multiple times. Some saw their income fall by 40%. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines. Families who had been middle class were visiting food banks by 2013. But here is what the historical record consistently shows about who does not pay. Those with hard assets, real estate in stable locations, ownership of productive businesses, largely preserved their wealth. Those with access to financial instruments denominated in foreign currencies did not lose everything. In Germany in 1923, the people who came through hyperinflation in relatively better shape were those who owned physical things. This included farmland, factories, and buildings, assets that maintained value regardless of the number printed on a banknote. In Argentina, in 2002, those who had managed to move dollars offshore before the Corralito preserved capital. Middle-class savers who trusted the local system lost entirely. The pattern is not subtle, it is not hidden. Inflation and currency collapse are the most efficient machines ever invented for transferring wealth. 41. The transfer moves from those who hold paper claims to those who hold real things, every single time. The scale changes, the geography changes, the decade changes, the transfer does not. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. 44. The pattern is not a theory. It is an observation repeated across dozens of countries, across a century of history. The only question is whether you will see the structure clearly before it becomes personally relevant. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing. And it might change everything. The historical record is also very clear about what distinguished the people who survived. It was not their luck, it was not their connections, at least not primarily, but specific, identifiable characteristics. These traits involve how they had positioned themselves before the crisis, not during it. The historians and economists who have studied these events all find the same patterns. Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff analyzed 8 centuries of financial crises in their landmark study, This Time is Different. Stay, Russ. Barry Eichengreen and Adam Tooze find the same patterns in the financial architecture of the 20th century. The first characteristic is what might be called monetary diversity. People who came through these crises had not concentrated all of their financial exposure in a single currency. When the Argentine Corralito froze bank accounts, the people hardest hit were those entirely inside that system. Those who had even a modest portion of savings outside, in foreign accounts or assets, had a lifeline. 57. This is not a sophisticated insight. It is the financial equivalent of not putting every egg in one basket. But the historical record shows that in good times, the incentive to diversify against your own currency is low. The domestic system is working. The interest rates are attractive. The effort of holding assets elsewhere feels unnecessary, until suddenly it is not just necessary, it is the only thing that matters. The second characteristic is an understanding of real versus nominal value. Nominal value is the number. Real value is the purchasing power. When the Weimar German mark collapsed, the numbers in bank accounts grew. You were, in nominal terms, richer than you had ever been. You were also, in real terms, destitute. The people who survived with their wealth intact understood from the beginning that a mark was not a store of value. It was a unit of measurement in a system that was breaking down. They held their value in things, not because they were wealthy, but because they understood the difference between the number and the thing. The third characteristic is time preference, meaning how far ahead they were thinking when they made decisions. Those who came through these crises had made decisions that looked inefficient in the years before the crisis hit. They had paid costs and foregone returns that only made sense in hindsight. This is not financial advice. This is historical pattern recognition. The record does not tell you what to do. It tells you what kinds of thinking consistently produce different outcomes across radically different historical contexts. Now we come back to Buenos Aires, back to our engineer on his Sunday morning with his media lunas. What happened to him? In the months after January 2002, he lost roughly 2/3 of his dollar equivalent savings. His pension was restructured and reduced. The economy contracted by nearly 11% in 2002 alone. The poverty rate in Argentina rose from around 35% before the crisis to nearly 57% by October 2002. Tens of millions of people who had been living stable, working lives suddenly found themselves unable to afford the basics. Our engineer survived. Argentina is a resilient country. By 2005, the economy was growing at 8%. But the savings were gone, the trust was gone, and the belief that playing by the rules would protect you was broken. The United States has not had that moment yet. The dollar's reserve status has been the shield. America's national debt is extraordinary, but the dollar has structural global demand, network effects, and 70 years of inertia. History says reserve currencies change. Ordinary people are almost always the last to know and the first to pay. The moment to understand these dynamics is before they become personally urgent. The conclusions are yours to draw. Understanding the system does not guarantee safety, but it is the beginning of seeing clearly. Subscribe and share this video.